In the spring of 2023, a demolition crew arrived at the northern edge of Yorkshire to dismantle what was left of Blackridge Asylum, a crumbling shell of red brick and soot-scarred walls nestled behind a line of crooked elm trees. The structure had been abandoned for over 6 decades, its presence long forgotten by all but the oldest villagers in Hallwick, a town that no longer appeared on modern maps. The contractor in charge had expected asbestos and rot. What he didn't expect was a silence so complete it smothered the sound of hammers before they struck. It was on the 3rd day of demolition, just before sunset, when they discovered the ledger. One of the workers, a man named Lewis Granger, was tearing up floorboards in what used to be the East Ward. Beneath layers of dust and collapsed joists, his crowbar struck something solid. He reached in and pulled out a flat wooden case, sealed with rusted latches and wrapped tightly in linen cloth. Inside, nestled between crumbling sheets of parchment, was a leather-bound book, its spine cracked, its pages warped by age and moisture. There was no title, only a small tag stitched to the front cover in red thread. Inventory C. But this wasn't an inventory of supplies. The entries were names. Dozens at first, then hundreds. All women, all patients. Next to each name was a date of admittance, and, in most cases, no discharge. Several pages featured simple sketches, crudely drawn in pencil and what looked disturbingly like blood. The drawings weren't of buildings or people, but of symbols. Circle, circles inside circles, crosses inverted. A single door repeated over and over. That same night, the demolition site was shut down. Granger never returned to work. His wife later told reporters that he spent the night pacing in silence, holding the ledger as though it might vanish if he let go. The following morning, he left a voicemail on the contractor's phone. 12 seconds of heavy breathing and a single whisper. They're still there. What followed wasn't an official investigation. No police were called. No historians dispatched. But the town council quietly issued a permit freeze. Journalists who tried to access the site were turned away. And the ledger? Gone. Disappeared before it could be photographed, catalogued, or sent to archive. But fragments of its contents had already leaked. A historian named Alice Pembroke, who specialized in post-Victorian psychiatric institutions, had spoken to Granger the night of his discovery. According to her, he read her 3 names aloud over the phone. All 3 women had one thing in common. They were never recorded in the National Health Archive. Not once. Not under aliases. Not transferred. According to every official record, they simply did not exist. So, why were they written in a hidden ledger buried beneath the floorboards of a ward that hadn't been used since 1939? Before we dive deeper into the story, I need to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone. Only the bravest souls dare to uncover the mysteries that history has tried to bury. If you're one of those true seekers, the kind who won't look away when the truth gets uncomfortable, hit the subscribe button, like this video, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? What city, what country? Do you believe that some places are cursed, or that they simply remember what was done to them? Now, let's go back to the beginning, to 1891. Blackridge Asylum was never meant to be a hospital, not in the modern sense. Its official name, when construction began, was the Yorkshire Institute for the Moral and Mental Correction of Women. That distinction matters. Because the people who funded it, wealthy industrialists, a silent circle of clergymen, and one reclusive physician, did not believe in healing. They believed in silence, in obedience, in the transformation of wayward females into compliant ghosts. The land it stood on had once belonged to the Remley estate, a now defunct noble line that vanished after the Great Cholera outbreak of 1852. Rumors persisted that the soil had never fully dried, that bones still shifted beneath the moss when it rained. But the church purchased it anyway, offering local villagers generous sums to keep their distance. The cornerstone was laid in autumn, during a thunderstorm that cracked 2 stained glass windows before the first patient had even arrived. The original structure included 3 wings, east, west, and south. The east was reserved for patients deemed salvageable. The west wing held those who resisted reformation. The south wing was for children, though this section would mysteriously close in 1903 after a fire destroyed the nursery and left no survivors. The fourth wing, Ward C, wasn't in any public blueprint. It was accessible only through a narrow stairwell hidden behind the laundry corridor. No staff member spoke of it. No patient returned from it. What made Blackridge so effective, so fearsome, was its invisibility. Girls were dropped off by their families under vague pretenses. She talks too much. She has impure dreams. She read a book not meant for women. And once admitted, they were no longer daughters or sisters or wives. They were entries in a book. If they ever left, they were shadows of who they'd been. Most did not leave. One of the earliest surviving reports comes from a nurse trainee named Elizabeth Horner, who worked there from 1897 to 1901. In her unpublished diary, discovered in a locked trunk decades later, she wrote, "The matron told me not to learn their names, that naming made them harder to forget. We referred to them by number. I was in charge of 12 through 25. 17 kept singing at night. When I asked what the song was, she said it came from under the floor." The diary ends abruptly, the last page torn out. What's most chilling about Blackridge isn't what's known, it's what was deliberately erased. In 1912, the asylum underwent a reorganization. 70% of its staff were replaced. Patient records prior to that year vanished. The official explanation? Paper rot and fungal contamination. But a local printing shop owner, whose grandfather had once worked on contracts for the asylum, claimed he saw incineration notices, over 300 files burned in a single night. He said they had names on them, names crossed out in red ink, and one word stamped in the corner of every folder, cleared. The public only heard of Blackridge again in 1956, when it was quietly decommissioned. No statement, no press release, just boarded windows and a fence no one asked about. Until that ledger was found. And if you believe the whispers that came with it, the ledger wasn't finished. Someone had planned to add more names, but something stopped them. Or maybe someone. In the next chapter, we'll travel deeper into the foundation of the asylum, the lies told by its architects, and the one room even the doctors refused to enter. In 1891, Blackridge Asylum officially opened its doors to the public, or rather, shut them on those it deemed unfit for it. The first patients arrived under cover of night, transported by covered wagons along the winding road that carved through the moors. The town of Halewick watched from shuttered windows. The church bell rang once, not for mass, but for discretion. No one asked questions. Not then. The patients were not criminals. They were not dangerous. Not in any conventional sense. Many were girls as young as 12, committed by their families for reasons so vague they might as well have been superstitions. Excessive melancholy, literary tendencies, inappropriate enthusiasm, fondness for solitude. Some were sent for having dreams, others for claiming to see people no one else could. The first intake log listed 33 names. One of them was Eleanor Mayhew, aged 17. Her entry was unique in one regard. Beside her name, scrawled in black ink, were the letters WC, Ward C, the one no one spoke of. The layout of the asylum was designed with precision, though the intention behind that precision remains unclear. Each wing operated as its own ecosystem, with its own staff, protocols, and curfews. Movement between wings was discouraged, punishable, in fact. But Ward C was different. It was neither wing nor ward, not really. It had no official staff, no assigned nurses, and yet it functioned. Elizabeth Horner, the nurse trainee whose diary hinted at the truth, made only 2 entries regarding Ward C. The first described a moment in the laundry corridor. She had lost a ring down a floor grate, and, upon kneeling to retrieve it, noticed a narrow seam in the wall, a gap just wide enough to slide a hand through. Behind it, she felt cold air. "I put my ear to the wall," she wrote, "and heard whispering. It was not English. It sounded like singing backward." Her second entry was dated 3 weeks later. "They've moved 17. The matron said she was a discipline case, but I saw the porter lead her through the laundry corridor. She looked at me. I swear she mouthed, 'Don't forget my name.' 17 never returned." It was common at Blackridge for patients to simply disappear. Officially, they were said to have reintegrated into society. Families were mailed letters, uniform in tone, sterile in content. But when historian Alice Pembroke tracked down 3 of those families, they all said the same thing. They never received a body. No funeral, no ashes, just silence. The West Wing, where the most resistant patients were housed, bore physical evidence of its cruelty. Restraint beds with worn leather straps, rooms with no windows, iron cages allegedly used for therapeutic separation. But even West Wing nurses whispered of worse things, things that happened below. A former maintenance worker, Thomas Evers, gave a testimony in 1948 during a rare internal inquiry after a girl named Lillian Tress went missing. He claimed there were passageways beneath the West Wing, corridors that didn't appear on any blueprint. He'd seen doctors escort patients into the stairwell behind the archives. They never came back up. The space, he said, wasn't for storage. The floor down there was wrong, he said. It wasn't stone or tile. It was dirt, fresh, like something had been dug up and refilled over and over. His testimony was dismissed. He was institutionalized within the year for paranoid hallucinations. He died in a facility in Glasgow, gagged and restrained. The rumors, however, didn't die with him. By 1910, local superstition had taken hold. Villagers spoke of lights flickering in the upper windows when no one lived inside. Children who played near the fence came home with nosebleeds and night terrors. One local schoolteacher claimed her students began drawing a black door with no knob, no handle, only a keyhole, without ever having seen it. The door matched the one drawn repeatedly in the ledger discovered by Lewis Granger. But let's go back to Eleanor Mayhew, the 17-year-old girl who vanished into Ward C. A month after her admittance, her name was quietly removed from the ledger, the only entry in which her discharge was not marked with the standard R for released or T for transferred. Instead, it was replaced with a small, hand-drawn spiral. That same symbol would later be found etched beneath the floorboards of her old room. Local legend claims that Eleanor wasn't just a patient. She was an experiment. Not in the medical sense, but in something far older. The matron at the time, a woman named Dorothea Quince, was rumored to have been involved with a fringe sect that believed in the purification of the female soul through isolation and silence. The sect was never officially named, but the term Order of the Hollow Mouth appeared once, scribbled in a margin of the asylum's quarterly report from March 1892. That quarter also recorded a 70% increase in patient reform success, though what that meant was never clarified. Pembroke believes the order used Blackridge as a testing ground, selecting girls with specific psychological vulnerabilities, isolating them in Ward C, and subjecting them to rituals cloaked as therapy. The spiral symbol appeared again in a set of private correspondences between Matron Quince and an unnamed bishop. One letter ends with the line, "The spiral has begun." She hears it now. What it was, no one knows, but the implications are clear. Eleanor Mayhew was chosen, and she wasn't the only one. Between 1891 and 1903, at least 14 girls were assigned to Ward C. Of those, only 2 were ever recorded as leaving. Neither could speak upon release. One was institutionalized elsewhere, the other drowned herself in the River Ouse 3 weeks after returning home. Still, the asylum remained operational. Still, families sent their daughters. Why? Because Blackridge promised results. And in a society where a woman's compliance was often valued more than her autonomy, results were everything. But what if those results came at a cost even the doctors couldn't predict? In the next chapter, we'll explore the strange case of Lillian Tress, the girl whose very existence threatens to unravel the entire narrative. Because Lillian didn't vanish. She came back. In 1912, Lillian Tress was admitted to Blackridge Asylum under the classification social maladjustment. She was 14 years old. Her mother, a seamstress in Wensford, claimed Lillian had become withdrawn, prone to episodes of muttering in a language she'd never been taught. Her father, a coal cart driver, refused to speak of the matter altogether. The family's priest, however, said something far more unsettling, that Lillian had begun waking at precisely 3:03 a.m., walking barefoot into the fields and whispering into empty wells. The asylum board approved her admittance in less than a day. Lillian was placed in East Wing initially, among the younger residents, under Nurse Mallory's care. Records from that period show nothing abnormal in her behavior. Quiet, intelligent, compliant. But the diary of Nurse Mallory, uncovered years later in the wall cavity of her abandoned flat, painted another picture. She wrote, "There's a calm around her that's not natural. Not the calm of a child behaving well, but the calm of someone listening to a song no one else can hear." She also described how Lillian would sometimes stop mid-step and look directly into a corner, always the same one in the corridor near the staircase, before whispering something under her breath. When asked what she'd said, Lillian replied, "I wasn't speaking to you." One entry, dated February 3, 1913, is partially torn, but the remaining text is clear. She drew it again. The door, no handle, no lock, just a keyhole in the spiral around it. This is the 4th time. Each time, she says she doesn't remember doing it. It was that drawing that triggered her transfer to Ward C. Officially, Ward C was no longer in use. Following a fire in 1907, small, contained, and suspiciously undocumented, the ward was sealed off for renovation. But patient transfers continued, quietly, always at night. No staff wanted to admit working there. Those who were assigned short rotations would often call in sick or resign altogether. Rumors spread of whispers in the walls, sudden nosebleeds, and clocks that stopped when you crossed the threshold. Lillian's experience in Ward C was almost entirely undocumented, except for 2 anomalies. The first came from an anonymous tip received by local journalist Arthur Fenning. In 1925, long after the asylum was shuttered, he published an article in the Halewick Chronicle titled "The Door Beneath the Beds." In it, he detailed a letter he'd received from someone claiming to have worked maintenance in Ward C. "The girl with the yellow ribbon," the letter began. "She asked to leave. She begged. But not because of pain, because she said the door was opening from the other side." According to the letter, the spiral-marked door wasn't physical. It appeared in dreams first, then in mirrors. Eventually, it was said to drip into reality, bleeding through the walls as shadow and cold. The second anomaly came in the form of a photograph. In 1932, 20 years after her admittance, and nearly a decade after she'd been presumed dead, Lillian Tress was seen walking the streets of York. The sighting was brief. She was dressed in outdated clothes, plain gray, ankle length, and her hair was tied with a yellow ribbon. The man who saw her, a bookseller named Harold Kinney, claimed she looked directly at him, smiled faintly, and kept walking. Kinney's statement might have been dismissed as imagination, except for the photograph. A tourist from Norwich had been taking photos of the architecture near High Pedal Street. When the film was developed, a single figure appeared in one frame, blurred, in motion, but unmistakably a girl with a yellow ribbon. The timeline made no sense. Lillian would have been in her mid-30s by then, but the girl in the photo looked no older than 14. When Pembroke tracked down Kinney's shop, now closed and converted into a cafe, she uncovered something more chilling than the photograph. In the attic, wrapped in cloth and stored in a box labeled "Not Mine," was a notebook. Its pages were filled with repetitive symbols, spirals drawn over and over with increasing pressure until the paper tore. On the final page was a single sentence: "She never stopped listening." Back at Blackridge, the aftermath of Lillian's disappearance was met with eerie indifference. No search, no inquiry. Her file was quietly stamped R for released, though no date was attached. Nurse Mallory left the asylum the following week. Her resignation letter, recovered from archives, read only, "I was warned not to remember." That phrase, "warned not to remember," reappeared in 3 other exit interviews from former staff over the next 10 years. None of them could recall specifics about Ward C. One woman cried for 2 hours during questioning and said only, "The clocks, they didn't run right." Lillian's story became local legend. Children in Halwick dared each other to walk near the old asylum gates at night and whisper her name. Elderly women claimed to see her reflection in their mirrors, always watching. But beyond folklore, a quiet academic circle began to form. Historians, occult researchers, even psychologists, all obsessed with the same question: what happened to the girls in Ward C? One theory emerged in 1951, published anonymously in an esoteric journal under the pseudonym Arcanum D. The author suggested that Blackridge's Ward C was never meant for healing. It was a containment structure, an attempt to seal off a psychic phenomenon that predated the building itself. According to the theory, Blackridge was built atop a listening point, a thin place between dimensions. The girls chosen for Ward C were not mad, but receptive. The rituals conducted under the guise of treatment were not designed to cure them, but to tune them, to amplify their resonance with whatever existed beneath. That would explain the door. That would explain why some girls never returned, why others did, changed, and why Lillian Tress, in her yellow ribbon and unaged face, was seen again in 1974, this time in Edinburgh, then again in Devon, always alone, always at the edge of crowds. Pembroke once said in a lecture, "Every place has its echo," but Blackridge didn't echo, it broadcasted. And perhaps Lillian was no longer a patient. Perhaps she was the signal. In the next chapter, we'll trace the origins of the spiral symbol, its strange recurrence across cultures, faiths, and cryptic manuscripts, and why it always precedes disappearance. Underneath the main wing of Blackridge Asylum lay a disused boiler chamber, sealed off since 1894 after an underground pipe burst and flooded the lower floor. Or so the story went. But in 1946, an engineer named Bernard Elvey, dispatched by the county to assess structural safety, discovered something far more troubling. The boiler room was bone dry. No signs of corrosion, no mineral deposits, just thick dust, undisturbed for decades, except for one detail: boot prints, dozens of them, small, as if made by children. They trailed from the far wall toward what appeared to be nothing more than old brickwork. But the mortar had been patched unevenly. Behind it, once broken through, was a narrow corridor that sloped down at a slight angle. No lights, just silence. The air, according to Elvey's later report, tasted metallic, like it had never been breathed. What he found at the corridor's end would never appear in official reports, but Elvey told a colleague before he vanished in 1948. The room was circular, about 20 feet wide. In the center, a chair bolted to the floor, with restraints at the arms and neck. Surrounding it, carved into the concrete, were spirals, some faint, some etched so deep the cement had cracked. And then, on the far wall, was something carved in Latin: Auditus sacrificium est. Listening is the sacrifice. The room was later filled with concrete by order of the council. Elvey's colleague, a man named Gerald Blaine, reportedly suffered a mental breakdown weeks after their last conversation. He was committed to Fairthorne Sanitarium in Devon and died there in 1956, repeating a single phrase for days before his passing. "I heard the spiral, it whispered my name." Dr. Evelyn Pembroke, by this time well into her research on Blackridge, grew fixated on what she called the spatial spiraling of the asylum's original blueprint. Using a map retrieved from the Halwick archives, she noted how every corridor, hallway, and wing, especially Ward C, was designed not for efficiency but rotation. The asylum curved inward. Hallways subtly angled toward the center. Rooms decreased in size. Windows were fewer the deeper you went. Even staff records indicated a higher incidence of vertigo, insomnia, and auditory hallucinations in those working near the heart of the building. What was at the center? A sealed staircase. Never opened, no key, no records. Pembroke speculated it led to the same sublevel Elvey found, but from the opposite side. Perhaps the original access point, long forgotten. And it wasn't just architecture. Inmates had been known to draw the spiral obsessively, even if they were blind or illiterate. One girl, Hannah Wake, was recorded drawing the spiral over 400 times in a single day, using her own fingernail in the underside of her bed frame. Hannah vanished in 1933. Her restraints were still fastened. Her bed undisturbed. Only a trail of dried blood led to the window, which was still locked from the inside. She was never found. But in 1989, a janitor renovating an elementary school built near the old Blackridge site reported something strange. A metal box embedded behind an old chalkboard. Inside were 5 drawings, each one of a young girl, face blank, arms outstretched, and always the spiral on her chest. The name at the bottom of each page: Hannah Wake. The paper was dated October 7, 1983. That detail didn't just raise questions, it shattered timelines. Hannah would have been in her 80s by then, if still alive. But the drawings were unmistakably done by a child's hand. Fresh, smooth, crayon marks. Experts confirmed the age of the paper. The drawings were no more than 6 years old. Pembroke posited a radical idea in her lecture titled Architectures of Containment. Her theory: Blackridge wasn't merely haunted, it was recursive, a structure where time did not pass linearly, but spiraled. A place designed not to house madness, but to feed on temporal instability, pulling those within into loops of memory, trauma, and disappearance. She used the phrase chronological bleeding. And if that was true, if time could bend within those walls, then Lillian, Hannah, and the dozens of other lost patients weren't dead. They were still in the building, trapped in folds of time that refused to move forward. One such fold may have been accidentally reopened in 1992, when Blackridge's grounds were partially excavated for a nearby housing project. Workers reported hearing a ringing sound underground, not mechanical but harmonic, like a tuning fork. One man collapsed from what he described as sudden internal screaming, though no source was found. The project was shut down, and yet, in the years that followed, strange events rippled through the nearby neighborhoods. Dogs refusing to walk past certain blocks, children waking at 3:03 a.m. and sitting motionless at the foot of their beds. One family moved after their son began drawing spirals in permanent marker on every mirror in the house. When asked why, he simply said, "To stop her from looking." The boy was 7. His name? Eli Tress. A genealogical search traced his lineage directly back to Lillian's older brother, an uncle she never met, who'd died in a mine collapse. But the resemblance was uncanny. Eli had the same hollow cheekbones, the same almond eyes, the same habit of humming when nervous. A private researcher who interviewed him was left shaken. In her notes, later published anonymously, she wrote, "The boy knew things about the asylum, about the staircase, about the room with no windows. When I asked how he knew, he whispered, 'Because I was there. Last time.'" That phrase echoed another statement. In 1959, an elderly former nurse named Nora Bell gave a deathbed confession to her daughter. She spoke of a door that bled, a child who aged backward, and a spiral that hummed in her ear every night until she covered her head in salt. Her final words were, "They never left. They just learned how to stay unseen." Blackridge's blueprints were eventually seized by the county. Dr. Pembroke disappeared in 1994. Her final recorded lecture ended mid-sentence. Her notes, desk, and audio recorder were found neatly placed in her study. The last sentence she ever wrote? "It's not the building that traps them, it's the attention." We begin to see now that Blackridge didn't simply harbor evil. It may have created it, by amplifying whatever frequencies those children could already perceive. It didn't just contain the spiral. It was the spiral. And the more we look, the more it listens. In the next part, we'll examine the institution's founder, Elias Vorn, his sudden wealth, his excommunication, and the cryptic letter found burned into the floorboards beneath his study. A letter that begins with one chilling line: "I did not build the asylum to heal them. I built it to keep something in." It was in the spring of 1857 that he submitted a proposal to the Crown for a sanctuary for the wayward mind, a design for what would become Blackridge Asylum. The blueprints were strange. Rooms arranged in elliptical paths, corridors that curved without necessity, internal spaces that shrank the deeper one walked. The central chamber, what he called the listening core, was designed without entry, without ventilation, and without light. When asked by the review board why such a space existed, Vorn replied, "There must be a silence strong enough to bind them." No one asked who "them" referred to. Vorn oversaw the construction personally. Every brick, every stone. Laborers claimed he'd walk the halls at night, whispering to himself in a tongue no one recognized. Some said it was Latin. Others swore it was older. During one documented incident, he fired an entire team of workers for breaking the spiral. They'd poured a foundation out of alignment by less than an inch. Vorn had them tear it out and begin again. He funded the asylum not through royal grants or medical institutions, but through private channels. A banker named Charles Audley, who'd made a fortune in colonial opium trade, fronted most of the money. Audley died of cardiac arrest 2 weeks before the grand opening. His body was found in a sealed study with the words, "Too late to unlisten," carved into his desk. There were no signs of forced entry. Blackridge opened in 1861. From the beginning, it attracted notoriety, not because of failures, but because of its silence. Other asylums across England were beset by overcrowding, reports of abuse, escapes, but not Blackridge. There were no escapes, no riots, no scandals, just vanishing. Between 1861 and 1885, 44 patients disappeared from Blackridge without record of release or death. Their names were erased from the rolls. When family members inquired, they received identical letters typed on identical paper, stating the patient had moved beyond the need for treatment. That phrase became so common, locals began to use it as euphemism for death. And yet, staff records showed a different story. Nurses complained of patients speaking in synchronized whispers. Janitors resigned en masse after hearing voices in the drains. One doctor left after a young girl in Ward E described his dead wife's perfume in detail, then told him, "She still forgives you." In 1872, a fire swept through the western wing, destroying the chapel and part of Ward A. No casualties were recorded, though one firefighter reported seeing a row of figures standing perfectly still in the smoke, all facing inward. He quit the force the following day. The western wing was rebuilt in haste, this time under the supervision of a new architect, Thomas Bede, a Freemason with a fascination for sacred geometry. Bede altered the curvature of the wing to match what he called a harmonic balance. Following his renovations, incidents dropped to near zero, until 1881. That year, 4 children were admitted to Blackridge under court order. Siblings from the East Midlands, orphaned after their mother was institutionalized for burning down a rectory. The children, Joseph, Clara, Thomas, and Isabel Maycroft, were all under the age of 12. They were never recorded as patients. In fact, their files listed them as observants. Within 3 months of their arrival, 3 staff members resigned, claiming the children never slept, never spoke, only drew. Dozens of spiral patterns, endless concentric circles, always drawn in groups of 4. In one unnerving detail, each child would complete a quarter of the spiral. When the pages were overlaid, the spiral was whole. In December of 1881, the children vanished. Their beds undisturbed, their drawings burned. Only one thing remained, a carving above their door, written in childlike scrawl, "Spirals don't end, they return." The following year, Elias Vaughan died suddenly. The coroner listed internal rupture as the cause, though no evidence of trauma or disease was found. His heart, when examined, showed signs of extreme stress, microscopic fractures in the muscle wall. His study was sealed by order of the trustees, but someone entered. In 1890, a janitor named Hugh Malley attempted to clean out Vaughan's old office. Behind the fireplace, he found a letter burned directly into the floorboards, not with ink, but through some form of branded impression. Experts could not explain the method, as the text seemed embedded within the wood grain itself. The letter read, "I built the spiral to contain the whisper, but the whisper listens too well. I no longer remember if I invented it or if it found me first. There is no center, only turning. If you find this, do not open the stairs." That same week, the sealed staircase at the asylum's center was found ajar. There were no keys. Security logs showed no entries. Cameras installed decades later revealed nothing. Just the door, closed one day, slightly open the next. No motion, no sounds, just stillness. By the early 20th century, Blackridge's reputation shifted. It was no longer seen as a place of healing, but of containment. Urban legends flourished, of patients who aged backward, of staff who walked into rooms and reappeared days later in different clothes, unable to speak. One persistent story was of the midnight knock. 3 raps on the wall, always behind a mirror, always between 3:03 and 3:06 a.m. When asked who knocked, patients would simply say, "The spiral's mouth." Records from 1924 show a growing number of psychiatric professionals refusing placement at Blackridge. The London Psychiatric Board issued a quiet moratorium, labeling the asylum temporally unstable, though such terminology never appeared in public records. Files were sealed, investigations closed, but a visitor's log from 1931 tells a different story. Dr. Charlotte Mervyn, a neuropsychologist from Cambridge, recorded her time at Blackridge in a private journal. She described her stay as lengthless. Days did not pass normally. Watches stopped. Light filtered strangely, and the patients were too quiet. Not sedated, attentive. Watching, waiting. She wrote, "I am not studying them, they are studying me." Her final journal entry, dated March 7, 1931, ended mid-sentence. "The spiral is not a shape. It's a call. It pulls inward. It feeds on." The page burns out. In Part 6, we'll trace the legacy of the listening core, a chamber many now believe was designed not just to trap the whisper, but to invite it, and perhaps amplify it. What was its purpose? Who, or what, was meant to sit in the chair at its center? And why, in one surviving blueprint, is the room labeled simply auditorium? There were no windows in the listening core. That was the first thing anyone noticed. No source of light, no air vents, no doors from the inside, only one point of entry, hidden behind a false wall, accessible through a mechanism that required 5 simultaneous key turns, each one kept by a different administrator. But even that safeguard failed to explain the room's function. It was neither an operating theater nor a holding cell. The walls were concave, not flat, and the floor sloped subtly toward a shallow circular depression at the center, no more than 3 feet across. In architectural notes, Elias Vaughan had labeled the room with a single word: auditorium. No one could recall it ever being used. Even during the height of Blackridge's operation, the listening core remained sealed. Blueprints archived in the Royal Institute of British Architects suggest the room had no declared purpose. Yet, Vaughan's original correspondence reveals otherwise. In a letter addressed to Charles Audley dated 1859, Vaughan wrote, "It will not contain them, but it will allow us to perceive what they once were. Before the fragmentation, before the breach. Who they were has never been determined." In 1933, after Dr. Mervyn's disappearance, the trustees of Blackridge commissioned a formal investigation into the room. A team of 6 engineers and 1 acoustician were dispatched to examine the chamber. All 7 signed strict non-disclosure agreements. Only one report was ever made public, by the acoustician Dr. Felix Arnold, who defected to Germany 6 months later. Arnold's findings were erratic. He claimed the room had auditory curvature, a phenomenon where sounds not only reverberated but returned altered. Words whispered into the walls were heard moments later, changed slightly in inflection or syntax, as if passed through a sentient filter. In one experiment, Arnold read Psalm 23 aloud. What came back, distorted and faint, was, "I shall find the valley of the shadow." When asked if he'd made an error in recitation, Arnold replied, "I didn't speak that version." Following this incident, the listening core was sealed again, its entrance buried behind concrete. But Blackridge had already changed. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, patients began to report a recurring dream, a spiral staircase descending into fog, with a single chair waiting at the bottom. They claimed to hear their own names spoken backwards, followed by the sound of teeth chattering not in cold, but in anticipation. One orderly, named Hugh Redmarsh, disappeared after reporting that he'd heard the sound from beneath the tiled floor of the western hallway. Like a choir gargling broken glass, he described it. 2 days later, his uniform was found neatly folded in the listening core. The door had not been opened. After this, the trustees declared the western wing off-limits. By 1951, Blackridge was only partially operational. Roughly 1/3 of its original wings had been closed or condemned. But the listening core remained untouched, its sealed chamber the subject of growing urban legend. Some staff members claimed they saw children outside its walls at night, drawing spirals into the dirt with twigs. No such children were ever found. That same year, a new administrator arrived, Dr. Edwin Lockmore, a forensic psychiatrist from Exeter with a background in war trauma. He dismissed the rumors. "The mind," he wrote in a letter to the ministry, "is a poor historian and an even worse cartographer. I do not fear what is drawn on these walls. I fear only what it makes us remember." Yet, within 6 months, Lockmore reversed course. He ordered the listening core reopened under clinical supervision. 4 patients were selected for auditory studies, each placed in proximity to the chamber while being monitored for neurological response. Recordings of their sessions were later reviewed by an independent panel. Patient 1 reported the sensation of a presence behind her eyes. Patient 2 spoke in reverse for 43 consecutive minutes. Patient 3's pulse synchronized to an unmeasured rhythm, 71 BPM, but pulsing in triads, not pairs. Patient 4 became unresponsive, mouth agape, lips murmuring without sound. He remained in that state for 3 days until he finally whispered, "He's listening." Lockmore terminated the experiment. 3 weeks later, he jumped from the bell tower. The listening core was sealed once more, this time not just with concrete, but with lead-lined panels and reinforced steel. And yet, something shifted in the atmosphere of the asylum. Staff noted that certain words were now carried. If one patient screamed, another, 3 wings away, would flinch. Lights flickered in rhythmic patterns. Medical logs began displaying timestamps that didn't exist. Entries recorded at 2561 or 0061. It was around this time that photographs of the core revealed something deeply troubling. In a series of long exposure shots taken for an architectural survey in 1956, analysts found a faint silhouette within the chamber, a seated figure, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. No personnel were inside during the exposure. Experts declared the image a double exposure artifact, yet the same figure appeared across 5 different negatives taken over 3 months. The figure was always seated, always facing the same direction, always looking directly at the camera. Rumors intensified. Patients began calling the chamber the well, and some refused to walk past it. Others began to draw spirals again, complex, mathematically precise patterns found etched beneath bed frames and into bars of soap. When questioned, they gave the same answer. It's the only shape that doesn't die. In 1962, a final attempt was made to demolish the listening core. Demolition crews arrived with orders to raise the chamber, but the equipment failed. 2 jackhammers broke on contact. Thermite charges burned for over an hour, but failed to breach the inner walls. A crane operator reported seeing his own name scratched into the concrete, written backwards and upside down. The order was withdrawn. The room was left intact. In a memorandum filed that same year, the Ministry of Health described the listening core as structurally sound, psychologically hazardous. No further entries were permitted, and Blackridge began its long, slow slide into obsolescence. But the whispers didn't stop. Local children began reporting dreams of a spiral man who sat in the dark and listened to secrets no one remembered telling. One girl said she heard her grandmother's confession whispered through a crack in the church floorboards. The girl's grandmother had been dead for 17 years. In 1970, an audio technician working for BBC's documentary on historic asylums was granted 1-hour access to the chamber. He placed a reel-to-reel recorder in the center of the room and waited outside. When the tape was reviewed, it contained no voices, no footsteps, only a sound like breathing, not human, but vast, like wind inside a cavern, shaped like a throat. The final 3 minutes of the recording were erased. Not blank, erased, magnetically stripped. When the technician returned to retrieve the recorder, he found a spiral etched into the reel itself. Not drawn. Etched, as if by heat or friction. A receiver for something never meant to be heard. The letters had been filed incorrectly. Tucked inside a manila envelope labeled Maintenance Logs, 1937-38, they were discovered by a junior archivist at the South Yorkshire Records Office in 1982, nearly 50 years after they were first written. At first glance, they appeared mundane, yellowing pages typed in Courier, addressed from Dr. Conrad Mervyn to an unknown recipient at the Ministry of Health. But one word kept repeating in their headers, underlined in black ink: transmission. What followed was not clinical language. Mervyn wasn't reporting on patients. He was pleading. The first letter, dated October 3, 1937, reads, "Something is being heard." Not hallucinated. Heard. Across patients. Across rooms. No source, yet identical content. I believe the architecture is acting as a conductor, or worse, a translator. He references incidents no one else ever logged, patients entering fugue states after prolonged silence, nurses breaking down during stormy weather, and the odd phenomenon of objects vanishing and reappearing several inches to the left of where they had been. At first, the ministry responded with polite skepticism. Then silence. After 3 more letters, Mervyn stopped sending them through official channels. The remaining correspondence is handwritten, unfiled, unstamped. In the letter dated November 11, 1937, he writes, "The core was never meant to contain the illness. It was meant to invite it." That line would be underlined 3 times in later red ink, likely by an investigator who reviewed the file during the 1956 Acoustic Anomaly Review. By December, Mervyn's notes turn frantic. He claims the spiral patterns appearing on patient linens are not simply symbolic, but instructional, that they correspond to a language older than speech, embedded not in sound, but in resonance, an idea that would not be publicly explored in cognitive science for another 30 years. The patients aren't mad, they're translating. What we called psychosis is merely imperfect reception. One day it will find someone fluent. On January 8, 1938, he refers for the first time to the mouth. It sits beneath, not in the earth, but under the frequencies of what we call real. The core is its throat. The walls are the teeth. I have heard it swallow. After that letter, all communication ceases. Mervyn was reported missing 3 weeks later. The ministry offered no public comment, only noting in internal memos that Dr. Mervyn has withdrawn for health-related reasons. No body was found. No family was contacted. It was as if he'd been erased, not just physically, but bureaucratically. But traces remained. In 1969, a graduate student named Clara Whitcomb from Cambridge University obtained partial access to Blackridge records while researching Victorian asylum design. She stumbled upon Mervyn's final notes and became obsessed. In her thesis, titled Sacral Architecture and Auditory Space in 19th Century Psychiatry, she proposed a radical theory: that certain buildings, particularly asylums, were not built to protect the insane from the world, but to protect the world from the messages those minds might receive. Blackridge, she argued, was built atop a fault line in perception, a spiritual cavity, a receiving station for things that language had not yet caught up to. Clara's work was never published. 2 weeks after her thesis was submitted, she was institutionalized at St. Mary's with auditory delusions and ideational preoccupations. She never spoke publicly again. Her final note to her advisor read only, "I heard it, not with ears, with memory. What she meant has been debated for decades, but the clues were always there, in the floor plans, in the patient records, in the music." Yes, music. For years, one of Blackridge's occupational therapy programs involved choral singing, meant to calm patients and regulate breathing. But in 1971, a volunteer music therapist named John Leland noticed something strange. When groups of patients sang in the key of D minor inside the central chamber, the walls would hum. Not metaphorically, physically. Resonant vibrations at 32.7 Hz, just below the threshold of human hearing, but felt in the spine. Leland recorded the phenomenon, capturing over 6 hours of low-frequency undulations before he was asked to leave the facility. Before departing, he left a note in the staff lounge. "It's not music, it's a reply." Leland died in 1973 of unknown causes. His tapes vanished in transit to the BBC. Still, whispers persisted. Local residents spoke of the soundless bell, a pulse that could be felt in the soil surrounding the asylum on quiet nights. Dogs refused to pass its gates. Children claimed the crows circled it not for nesting, but to listen. One boy, aged 9, told his teacher that he knew what the building was saying. "It's not words," he said. "It's the part of silence that isn't empty." When asked to explain, he drew a spiral. But unlike the others, tight, controlled, endless, his spiral broke at the outer edge. It bled out into chaos. His fingers trembled as he shaded the broken edge. "That's where it gets in," he whispered. The teacher never returned to the school. By 1984, Blackridge was no longer on official maps. No road signs pointed to it. Locals spoke of it only in past tense, as if it had been demolished. But it hadn't. The structure still stood, though overgrown, its windows black, its bell tower leaning at a slight but growing angle. No agency claimed jurisdiction. The ministry denied ownership. And yet, one light always remained on, in the listening core. That's where the story returns. In Part 8, we'll hear the final intercepted recording from Blackridge's radio tower. A transmission received not by a radio, but by a sleeping man over 60 miles away. A message with no known origin, no earthly language, and no sender. A message that ends with a date, and a name no one remembers speaking. The man's name was Albert Shaw. He lived in a modest flat in Sheffield, 63 miles from the overgrown ruins of Blackridge Asylum. A retired cartographer with a quiet life and no history of psychiatric disturbance, Albert had spent his final years collecting vintage radios, Not to use them, just to clean, label, and line them up like books along the walls of his small study. None were plugged in. On October 17, 1986, Albert fell asleep in his armchair, a dog-eared copy of a treatise on the audible spectrum resting on his chest. According to neighbors, the power in his building had gone out for nearly 7 minutes around 2:30 a.m., an outage unregistered by the utility company and limited only to his address. He awoke at 3:04 a.m. and began writing. A full 10 pages. Every word identical in size and spacing, as if printed by machine. The content was unintelligible. Glyphs, spirals, parallel lines intersected by slashes and curving dashes that resembled no known language. But Albert insisted it was a transcription, not of something he heard, but something he had remembered. "It was already in me," he told paramedics. "I was just waiting to be the pen." He died 24 hours later. Heart attack. No signs of trauma or stress. His final recorded sentence, left on a tape he used to narrate his field notes, was this: "The tower never stopped transmitting. We just stopped understanding." When his notes were analyzed by Professor David Rourke at the University of Manchester, he found a curious anomaly. The spatial arrangement of the symbols matched the echo pattern of a bell ringing inside a hollow dome, specifically the bell from Blackridge's own tower, recorded in 1935. Somehow, Albert's language followed the architecture of sound, not syntax. But what happened next brought the entire investigation to a halt. 3 weeks after Albert's death, a woman named Celia Howden contacted the university. She was Albert's niece, and in sorting through his belongings, had found something behind the false backing of a radio casing, a reel-to-reel tape marked only 317. Rourke played the tape in a soundproof lab. What he heard lasted less than 90 seconds. It began with silence. Not ordinary silence, but the compressed kind that suggested the removal of sound rather than its absence. Then came the static, unlike any he had studied before. It pulsed, like a living thing struggling to regulate breath. Then came the voice, or rather, the absence of a voice. What emerged wasn't a spoken sentence, but an impression, the sensation of being spoken to, without language, without vibration, without anything that should have triggered understanding. And yet, Rourke understood it. He transcribed what he felt, not what he heard. "It has learned our shape. It is coming through the floorboards. It will teach us how to forget in sequence. What we named the core was its ear. What we buried was not the patient." Rourke never played the tape again. Instead, he mailed it, without duplication or backup, to the British Library Sound Archive, with instructions to seal it for 50 years. As of today, it remains unreleased, catalogued as Undesignated Private Tape, 1986 Sheffield Acquisition, UN 317B. But this wasn't the end. Following the tape's submission, Rourke began experiencing what he called sympathetic dreams. Always the same: a spiral staircase beneath a floorless chamber, the sound of scratching on iron, and the recurring vision of a child's drawing on the wall, a black figure with a listening horn instead of a head. He wasn't alone. 3 researchers who handled Albert's tape later reported persistent ear infections, spatial disorientation, and in one case, sudden onset aphasia. Yet their MRIs showed no neurological damage. When asked to describe what they experienced, they all used the same term: echo sickness. Rourke believed Blackridge hadn't just been a place where madness was studied, but a format, a psychological instrument designed to convert trauma into signal, to refine human suffering into frequencies too precise to forget. He theorized that the architecture, the rituals, The very structure of patient life was not therapeutic, but sacrificial. That Blackridge was a temple, not to God or science, but to pattern. A pattern older than belief, and, like all temples, it needed priests. That's where Sister Margaret returns. In the brief, redacted notes from 1932, there's mention of a Margaret Elowen, a novice nurse who entered Blackridge at the age of 17 and never left. Her name appears not in patient rosters but in shift logs, always marked midnight to bell. She was responsible for the tower, not cleaning it, tuning it. Witnesses describe her standing barefoot in the chamber, arms raised, as wind passed through broken panes, creating notes across the cracks. She would hum in response, always the same pitch, always the same rhythm. A nurse who knew music. A girl who knew silence. And it was she who, on December 21st, 1939, the winter solstice, was last seen walking into the core with a set of tuning forks and not emerging. Her body was never recovered. Her name was struck from staff records in 1940, but her humming, her frequency, was recorded once, accidentally, by a janitor testing new condenser mics. That humming matches the tone heard on Albert Shaw's tape. 47 years later. This isn't coincidence. This is recurrence. Rourke believed that Sister Margaret wasn't transmitting. She was receiving, from something waiting to be remembered. Something that doesn't speak in language, but in spatial logic, harmonic dissonance, and inverted cause. A recursive structure designed not to hold the mad, but to rebuild them in the image of what listened beneath. The blueprints were never meant to be found. Folded behind a false panel in the Blackridge Chapel altar, they were uncovered in 1994 by a demolition crew tasked with removing asbestos-laden beams. Yellowed, brittle, and drawn in charcoal ink, the plans bore no title, no architectural signature, and no dates. Yet the seal of the Crown Psychiatric Directorate was faintly embossed on the corner, despite the directorate having only existed from 1912 to 1931. But it wasn't the age that disturbed the team. It was the impossibility. The structure mapped in those blueprints wasn't a chapel. It was a loop, a perfectly recursive corridor design with no beginning, no end, and no vertical exit. If constructed, a person walking inside it would pass 6 identical rooms, each with mirrored dimensions, until returning to the start without any sense of having turned. Yet, no such structure existed above ground. That's when they noticed the annotations. Handwritten in red ink along the inner perimeter of the design were these words: "Not all doors open. Some hum." And below it, in fainter handwriting, barely legible, "Repetition is obedience. Forgetting is reward." The architect's name was never identified, but the handwriting matched the journal entries of Dr. Howard Thane, the senior psychiatric officer at Blackridge during the 1920s. His entries, long believed to be destroyed in the 1943 fire, began resurfacing in auction circles in the early 2000s. Tattered pages sold as curiosities. One page in particular is now infamous. It's dated October 10, 1929. Thane writes, "The patients no longer speak of escape. They ask only to return to the loop. They say it's cooler there, more orderly. They describe a 7th room we never built. A room with no corners and walls that ring like tuning forks when they whisper. I fear the chapel is not ours. I fear it was never meant to face east." He never elaborates on what that meant, but satellite mapping of the Blackridge ruins in 2004 showed something the original site surveys missed. The chapel, like most religious structures, was assumed to face east, but its true alignment, when corrected for magnetic deviation, is north-northeast, pointing directly toward a cluster of ancient barrows predating Roman occupation. And in one of those barrows, known locally as Thorn's Eye, radar imaging detected an unnatural cavity, hexagonal in shape, 20 feet below ground. It has never been excavated. Not because it can't be, because every permit request has vanished. 3 independent researchers, including one from the British Geological Survey, submitted separate excavation proposals between 2005 and 2008. All 3 reported receiving confirmation letters, none of which can be found in official archives. When they tried to follow up, each received identical rejections citing spatial instability concerns. None of them knew each other. All 3 rejections were signed by the same official, M. Elowin, a name not present in any modern registry, but eerily close to Sister Margaret Elowin. So now the question isn't whether Blackridge was hiding something, it's what it was built upon. In simple terms, the asylum was an instrument, and the patients were its strings. One room was labeled silent, not silent as in quiet, but as in soundproofed against God, a phrase that appears repeatedly in Thane's marginal notes. This silent room, located at the deepest level of the asylum, had no documented use, but it appears prominently in Dr. Thane's final entry before his disappearance in 1931. We've succeeded in negating reference. The patients no longer orient themselves to light or voice, only tone. I've requested to be placed in silent. I want to forget, in perfect pitch. That was the last anyone heard from him. His office was found abandoned, windows bricked from the inside, and a single sentence etched into the wall with fingernail. I heard it blink. The silent room was sealed during the 1943 fire. No modern team has entered it, but according to fire inspection reports from that year, no source of ignition was ever identified. No accelerants were used. The flame's epicenter was subterranean. It came from below. Yet the chapel altar remained untouched. Not scorched, not blackened, not even warm. And what was behind that altar, the false panel, the loop, the plans, it all survived. Preserved like offerings. As if the fire knew what to burn and what to leave untouched. In recent years, the ruins of Blackridge have become a site of pilgrimage, not for tourists, but for the desperate. Families who claim their children speak in harmonics, who say their loved ones dream of looping rooms, who wake at 3:17 a.m. with bleeding ears and no memory of sound. They come with offerings, not flowers, forks, dozens of tuning forks wedged between bricks, scattered at the chapel entrance, balanced atop the decaying threshold like keys waiting to be played. Each one tuned to a different note, each one waiting for resonance. It never stopped listening. The letter was never mailed. Folded 4 times and sealed with red wax, it was discovered in 1989 behind a panel in the East Wing laundry chute during a restoration assessment. There was no envelope, no return address, just a date, March 3, 1931. It was written on Blackridge stationery in trembling script. And though unsigned, handwriting analysis confirmed it matched entries from nurse Edith Lowry, who had worked in the asylum for 15 years before vanishing without record later that same month. The letter is addressed simply, "To whoever finds this after it's over." "They made us line up," it begins, "all of us who were still lucid enough to walk without assistance. We were told it was a test of loyalty, what they called the quiet ritual." Dr. Thane stood at the front of the chapel, facing the altar, but he wasn't wearing his white coat. He was wearing something else, something older. Hand-stitched, black, with a crimson trim, and around his neck, a string of tuning forks like rosary beads. He did not speak. He simply struck one fork, A low, steady hum, and every patient in the room went still. No trembling, no muttering, not even blinking. I saw Mr. Halberd, who hadn't spoken in 3 years, mouth the word again. Then Thane raised a second fork and struck it. That's when the altar began to breathe. The letter describes what happened next in halting detail. Nurse Lowry claims that the stone beneath the altar, long believed to be an ordinary limestone base, began to pulse, subtly at first, like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Not in rhythm with any human breath, but in a deeper, slower cadence. 6 beats per minute, matching the looping walk protocol used on Blackridge's most unstable patients, a walking meditation intended to disassociate them from linear time. Only this time, it wasn't a human inducing it. The sound didn't echo, she writes. It swallowed itself. Every time he struck a fork, the vibration didn't bounce off the walls. It sank into them. The stone darkened, the air thickened. It felt like the walls were listening. Lowry describes how the patients began humming in unison, not melodies but frequencies. She calls it a human chord, a living resonance that made her vision blur and her ears weep. Several staff members collapsed, their eardrums ruptured. One tried to crawl for the exit and was dragged back, not by hands, but by gravity. The pull, she said, came from beneath the altar. That was when Dr. Thane opened the hidden panel. The loop was real. The corridor beneath the altar, mapped in secret and sealed for decades, was finally revealed. And from it came a wind that didn't move air. Nurse Lowry's letter calls it the hush. It wasn't silence. It was the removal of everything but silence, a vacuum of meaning. I forgot my name. I forgot sound. I forgot the sky. But I remembered obedience, as if that was all I had ever been. The patients walked into the corridor willingly, one by one, 6 in total. Lowry recounts each one stepping forward, humming their respective tone and disappearing down the spiral. Not once did they cry out. Not once did they look back. When the 6th passed through, the hum peaked into what she calls a silence with teeth. The walls of the chapel cracked, and Thane turned to the remaining staff. He said it had accepted the pattern, she writes, that we had calmed the architecture. And then he stepped in himself. No ceremony, no farewell, just a whisper. I want to forget, in perfect pitch. After that, the wind stopped. The panel sealed. The tuning forks fell to the floor, silent. Blackridge never recovered from that night. Within 2 weeks, reports of patient violence spiked. Several staff members took their own lives. The matron attempted to burn the medical records but was stopped. And then, on March 17th, the fire began. Official reports claimed faulty wiring. But Nurse Lowry ends the letter with a different claim. The building wasn't burning. It was shedding, peeling away the layers that didn't belong. We had fed it patterns, and it wanted to be pure. It wanted to hum forever. Her final line is scrawled with such force the pen tore through the page. Don't rebuild it. Don't remember it. And for the love of what still listens, don't sing. To this day, Blackridge Asylum's ruins remain fenced off, not due to instability, but due to unexplained resonance. Acoustic engineers report tonal distortions around the old chapel site, a standing frequency, always present, always at 114 Hz, the same note produced by the average human whisper. Locals call it the hum. Some claim it only stops when someone dies nearby. In 2017, a filmmaker attempted to document the ruins for a paranormal series. His footage was never released, but in the audio logs leaked by his assistant, a faint loop plays behind his narration. It's a woman's voice, repeating one phrase, It never stopped listening. It never stopped listening. It never stopped. The last transmission was received at 3:17 a.m. Then silence. No trace of the crew was found. Only 6 pairs of shoes at the threshold, and a tuning fork, still vibrating. No one knows who placed it. But etched into the handle, in tiny shaking letters, were the words, "I heard it blink."